Hi again then guys, and welcome to another tune setup for one of the new vehicles from the 1.25 patch, of course, the Lancia Delta, which again we will be taking a look at later on today in its own review, just like we are with each of the cars from the pack. Now, for this particular tune I decided to move away from the circuit tunes, and at the same time as being a good all-wheel drive car, it's not necessarily the most ideal for something like a drag tune, because it doesn't really have the top-end power to go up against many of the other drag cars in the game, like Skyline, or even something like a Supra, for instance, which of course doesn't have all-wheel drive, but more than makes up for it with sheer power. So what I decided to do instead was to go back to the car's roots of course, rallying, to make a rally tune for it, since many people will probably use it for that in some form or another. So as far as upgrades go, as you can see, I have upgraded it extensively, in fact fully, as far as power and weight, but what I've actually done as far as power in particular is just tuned it up to the peak of N300, which is 343 horsepower. Now the reason why I've done that is because the lower classes tend to have cars which are not necessarily rally bred to begin with, whereas the higher ones you can get stuff like actual rally cars, you can get cars with huge amounts of power, and again, the Delta, it's the kind of car that you should use within its comfort zone, and although it can punch above its weight, it works best within, say, the 300 to 400 horsepower region, at least as far as I'm concerned. So that's why I've gone for that amount of power, to keep it in N300, keep it in its prime. As far as weight though, we've dropped that as much as we can. And again, partially due to the all-wheel drive, but also the reasonably large engine. It's not quite as light as you might expect for a hatchback, but as far as traction control, of course you want that turned off for off-roading. Dirt tyres, goes without saying. As far as the suspension, we've made some changes compared to the settings that the game gives you, because incidentally I would recommend going up to the top of the screen here and swapping to a dirt setup before you do the rest of this, because if you don't, if you do it under the road setup, and then enter a rally stage, the game will automatically swap you to a dirt setup and you'll lose all of the settings. So make sure that you go to dirt first and then do the rest of this. That is an important thing. So going back to the suspension, we've got the ride height on 160mm, which is moderately high. As far as the frequency, I've put it to 1.75. 5 for anti-roll, then as far as the compression aspect of the dampers, 62, then 92 for the rebound, of course neutral camber and tow, you really don't need any on this car. Downforce you can't adjust obviously. As far as the diff, I've gone for the lowest all round, and this is probably the primary car so far in the game that I do notice the lack of that torque distribution advantage that we've had in most of the other games. Certainly in GT6, because sending more torque to the back end makes a huge difference to stuff like the Delta and the Audi Quattro, because they naturally have a lot of understeer. So having like a 30-70 split, for instance, would often do a lot to help that instead of closer to 50-50. But you can't change that, so we have to make do with the rest of the diff, at least for the moment. And then as far as the gearbox, we've got a relatively close ratio setup, but also some decent top speed for when you do need it, which could be sometimes, depends on the rally track really. So an auto setting of 155 miles per hour, then individual gears of 2850, 2, 1525, 1.2 and 1, with that final drive, as you can see, of 3.1. So you've got decent enough top speed when you need it, around 160, but also gears that you can get through relatively quickly and easily for actual rallying. So that's it for my tune, and of course when it comes to the gearbox it depends on the power, when it comes to the diff it depends on personal preference. So there are plenty of things that you can chop and change if you need to, but what you want to see of course is what can this actually do as a rally car, in particular in N300. Well, as I usually do, we've brought it to, of course, Sardinia. Relatively short lap, you can do it in around a minute 20, a minute 30, that kind of time. So to give you some idea of how quick this one can be, this is only about 2 seconds off the pace of my actual Toyota Group B Rally Spec 86. Which of course, if you watch the review that I did for that car, you can see that lap of around a 122 with that car, and that's not a slow lap. I was basically, if I remember correctly, improving lap after lap. And although of course there are definitely people out there who could take it even quicker, obviously, that goes to show the kind of potential that this one has, being only around 2 to 3 seconds off the pace of an actual, say, 550 to 600 horsepower rally car, an actual rally car. that shows the potential that it has. Now, the most important thing I would say about driving the car, because the great thing about the Delta and the Quattro is that they are completely predictable. They never surprise you by what the handling does. That's why they're so good. But that doesn't mean that they're perfect. The reason why they're predictable is because they always understeer. And so to counteract that, or to use it, I would always recommend turning into the skid instead of trying to countersteer like you would with most cars. Turn into the skid, turn into the understeer, and keep turning into the corner even when you feel like it's too much, because the understeer of the car will keep it in line and you'll actually end up outperforming cars with a lot more power. So if you do decide to use this build, it's very competitive. In N300 there are very few cars, even in N4 or N500, that can keep up with it. This is actually faster than my N400 Porsche rally build, so shows the potential that it's got. So I hope you enjoy it if you do decide to use it, and you can click on screen here to see plenty more tunes just like it. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.